everybody. Welcome back to a special edition of Anna Reads. As of last night, I watched for the first time the Disney animated feature film Saludos Amigos, which, if you haven't seen it, take 45 minutes, pull it up on Disney Plus, and give it a watch. In my opinion, it's actually held up pretty well. Walt Disney and his team of animators visited Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia to get inspiration for animation. It's Donald and Goofy that look like schmoes, not the indigenous people. And if you'll notice my little buddy here, this is a llama. Yes, Donald Duck most definitely loses a disagreement with a llama. Oh, and the dress has its own story. My dad brought this to me from Ecuador when I was actually quite a small child. I was maybe 11. And now it fits as a sundress. So before I go, banging on about Saludos Amigos or just how much I miss my dad, let's jump right back into Walt Disney, an American Original by Bob Thomas. We were on Unit 1, Chapter 5, if I am not much mistaken. Yes. Nope, that's Chapter 6. Here we are. Unit 1, Chapter 5. A year in France had been a heady experience for a Midwesterner not yet 18. And Walt Disney landed in New York brimming with hope and optimism. He was stimulated by the size and energy of Manhattan, and he wandered the streets with unabashed awe of the high buildings. I had a similar experience myself the first time I ever went to New York City. I come right out of Penn Station and I tell myself, I am not gonna be that tourist schmuck who looks right straight up as soon as I come out of the station. What did I do? I look right straight up as soon as I come out of the station, almost fell on my butt. Among the delights he found in New York were 2 comedies of Charlie Chaplin. Walt hurried home to Chicago, and like many other young men returning from overseas, he saw his hopes turn to ashes. He had brought French laces and perfume to the girl who had promised to wait for him, but she had married 3 months before. When Walt visited Russell Maz to claim his German Shepherd, he learned the dog had died of distemper. Russell had acquired a job and a girlfriend and had lost all interest in a voyage down the Mississippi. Elias and Flora Disney were astonished at the change in their youngest son. He had grown to 5 feet 10 inches, and he was broad-shouldered and husky at 165 pounds. He had matured in other ways. His outlook was worldly, too much so for his father's taste. But Walt could still be boyishly playful, as when he described to his believing mother the huge Prudential Insurance sign he had seen atop Gibraltar as his ship passed through the strait. He showed her a small box, which he said contained a battlefield souvenir. She shrieked when she opened it. Inside was a bloody thumb, in reality Walt's own, painted with iodine and stuck through the back of the box. If I'm not mistaken, that is the actual oldest trick in the book. A return to high school was unthinkable after Walt's European experiences, nor would he consider a job his father offered at the jelly factory for the handsome salary of $25 a week. Dad, I don't want that kind of job, Walt insisted. Elias reminded him that thousands of unemployed veterans would welcome such a position, but Walt remained firm. If you've ever read Beverly Cleary's book, 15, the main character, Jane Purdy's mom, loves to drag lots of girls into arguments. So this is just my own personal insight, but dragging unknown multitudes, lots of girls, lots of, anything that starts with lots of insert noun here, if you must drag an unknown multitude into the argument, you've probably already lost the argument. Then what do you want to do, Walter? The father asked. I want to be an artist, Walt replied. "And how do you expect to make a living as an artist?" Elias asked. "I don't know," Walt admitted. He knew that he didn't want to remain in Chicago. The city seemed noisy and dirty and unappealing. He decided to return to Kansas City. Roy had gone there after his discharge from the Navy at Seattle in February 1919. Walt wanted to see his boyhood friends, and he was convinced that the Kansas City Star would hire him as a political cartoonist. Against his father's wishes, Walt packed all his belongings, including the Red Cross uniform, and boarded a train for Kansas City. Walt and Roy Disney had a joyful reunion at the Disney house on Bellefontaine Street, and the brothers talked until early morning about their adventures overseas. Roy was working as a teller for the First National Bank of Kansas City at a salary of $90 a month. He was hoping for an advancement so he could marry Edna Francis, sister of Mitchell Francis, who had gone into the Navy with Roy and worked in the same bank. Walt told Roy of his plans to become a political cartoonist, and he displayed drawings he had done in France. He packed up the drawings and went to the offices of the Star, where he was curtly informed that there were no openings for a cartoonist. Walt decided he would work his way up through the ranks, and he answered an advertisement for a copy boy at the Star, wearing his Red Cross uniform to lend him maturity. It worked too well, and he was told he was too old for the job. Walt protested that he was only 18, but the employment man was unhearing. He cited Walt's experience as a Red Cross driver and suggested that he apply for work in the transportation department. "I want to be a cartoonist, not a driver," Walt replied. He took his cartoon samples to the Kansas City Journal and drew a favorable reaction from the editor, Lawrence Dickey. But the Journal had no immediate need for another cartoonist. Walt reported his disappointments to Roy, who tried to persuade his brother to seek more practical employment. Roy mentioned his brother's plight to another bank worker, who told him of 2 commercial artists who were seeking an apprentice. Roy telephoned his brother and told him to apply at the Pesman Rubin Commercial Art Studio in the Gray Advertisement Building. Walt hurried downtown and met Louis Pesman and Bill Rubin, who were impressed with the young man's eager manner. They asked him to return with samples of his artwork, and he showed them his sketches of Parisian streets. Pesman and Rubin told him to report for work the following day, the salary to be determined later. The new employee was assigned to create rough drawings of advertisements and letterheads for farm equipment and supply companies. The first job was for a firm that sold egg-laying mash, and Walt sketched hens on nests, eggs overflowing nests, and hens hatching dollar signs. Lou Pesman, who taught night school at the Fine Arts Institute, had noted that most young artists resented criticism. Not Disney. One day he was working on a layout for the Cary Salt Company, drawing cows licking salt blocks. Pesman looked over his shoulder, erased some lines, added others, and Walt welcomed the changes. At the end of the week, the 2 partners announced that their new assistant would be paid $50 a month. "That'll do fine," said Walt, not looking up from his work. When he reported the news to Roy, he admitted that he would have accepted half that amount. Walt was eager to please his new employers. Pesman designed covers for the weekly program of the Newman Theater, and he instructed Walt to finish the artwork on the front cover. It was a job that normally would have required a day, but Walt finished both the front and back covers in 3 hours, adding original touches of his own. He was assigned to the artwork for the Newman Theater newspaper advertisements, and years later, in an advertising conference at his Burbank studio, he recalled one of his contributions. The Newman was playing a Cecil B. DeMille picture, male and female, and all I had to work with was a standing photo of the stars, Gloria Swanson and Thomas Megan. Well, I thought it would make a better ad if they were lying down, and that's how I drew them. "Hey, Luther, you gonna come over here and be sweet?" That's a good boy. Yeah. Yeah? He always gets sore at me when I bring plushies into it. A co-worker at Pesman Rubin was a stolid young Dutchman with the curious name of Ube Iwerks. If you actually know how that's pronounced, please for the love of mud correct me. I want to get it right. I only know him as Iwerks. The son of a Dutch immigrant, he was the same age as Walt. Like Walt, Ube had left high school before graduating. Ube had worked for a banknote company and on a farm, then was hired by Pesman Rubin in the fall of 1919 to do lettering and airbrush work. When Walt Disney arrived a month later, the two 18-year-olds became friends. Walt showed Ube the lettering samples he had executed when he was hired. Most applicants lettered the alphabet, but Walt had written variations of his own name. Walter Disney, W.E. Disney, Walt Disney, Walter Elias Disney. He asked Ube which one seemed best. Walt Disney, said Ube, and Walt agreed. Both young men turned out a large volume of artwork for farm catalogs and Christmas ads for department stores and theaters. Then the pre-holiday rush ended, and both Walt and Ube were let go. Walt applied for work with the post office, and he delivered mail until after New Year's. Walt and Ube Iwerks, he later shortened his name to Iwerks, that's how I know him best, discussed going into business for themselves. Walt Pfeiffer, Walt's boyhood pal and co-performer, persuaded his father to hire the two artists to design lettering for the United Leatherworkers Journal. Walt searched for other business, and he called on a former neighbor, Al Carter, who edited a trade publication, the Restaurant News. Carter said he didn't have enough work to keep the two young artists busy, but he offered them a couple of desks in his office in return for an occasional design. Walt saw this as the chance to begin his and Ub's enterprise. He wrote his mother to send him the $500 he had earned as a Red Cross worker and sometime crapshooter in France. His mother insisted on knowing why he wanted the money. He replied that he was going into business, adding that it was his savings and he could do what he wanted with it. After more exchanges of letters, she sent him half the amount. That's a mom for you. The partners intended to call their enterprise Disney Iwerks, but when they put up the listing in the lobby of the Railroad Exchange Building, they discovered it sounded too much like an optical firm. So it became Iwerks Disney Commercial Artists. Iwerks did the straight drawing and lettering. Disney was the cartoonist and salesman. He hustled around to print shops, theaters, stores, and oil companies in search of work. The first month's business netted $135, more than they had been receiving at Pesman Rubin. The Iwerks Disney firm lasted only a month. On January 29, 1920, Ub spotted an advertisement in the Kansas City Star. Artist, cartoon and wash drawings, first-class man wanted. Steady, Kansas City Slide Company, 1015 Central. Ub discussed the ad with Walt, and both agreed that Walt should apply for the job. He reported for an interview with the head of the Kansas City Slide Company, A. Vern Codger, at the firm's office on Central Street. Codger was impressed with the young man's cartoons and offered him a position at $40 a week. Walt was overwhelmed by the salary, but he had hoped to work part-time while he and Ub continued their new enterprise. Codger insisted he wanted a full-time cartoonist. Walt discussed the matter with his partner, and Ub urged him to take the job. Yes, what is it? I can manage the business, Ub assured him, but he was not outgoing enough to be a salesman, and the business quickly dwindled. In March 1920, Walt persuaded Codger to hire Ub, and Iwerks Disney went into limbo. Oh, you big baby, yes you are. After Walt had been working a few weeks at the slide company, which had moved to 2449 Charlotte with the new name of Kansas City Film Ad Company, he received a call from Lawrence Dickey at the Journal. The newspaper needed a cartoonist, and Walt could have the job. If the offer had come earlier, the course of his career might have proved far different. But Walt had been introduced to something that intrigued him more than newspaper cartooning. He declined the Journal's offer. Now he was making cartoons that moved. Kansas City Film Ad produced 1-minute advertising films to appear in motion picture theaters. The animation was primitive. Human and animal figures were cut out of paper and pinned to a sheet. The joints of the figures were moved and photographed, giving the illusion of movement. And now, if I'm not mistaken, that's how I remember South Park to have been animated in its very, very early days, but truth be told, I was much too young for South Park when it first aired. As a matter of fact, I think I might still be. The artists made their cutouts and gave them to the cameraman with an outline of the action. Each department was jealous of its own secrets and declined to share them, but Walt was curious to learn how things worked. He made friends with the cameraman, Jimmy Lauer. I'm going to go with Lowery. Lowerre. I think that's Lowery. Who showed the young cartoonist how the paper figures were photographed in stop motion to provide the illusion of animation. Soon Lowery permitted Walt to operate the camera himself. Walt wasn't satisfied with such a crude method of animation. He noted how the New York-made movie cartoons like Mutt and Jeff and Coco the Clown series moved with greater realism. They were created with drawings, not cutouts, and Walt was determined to learn how. He found 2 books in the Kansas City Public Library. Support your local libraries now more than ever. I'm not asking. One, a simple handbook by Carl Lutz on the essentials of animation. The other, this is the oddest spelling of the name Edward I've ever seen in my entire life. Eadweard. I think that's Edward. Edward Muybridge's classic study of human and animal motion. Walt pored over Muybridge's photographs of running horses and athletes in movement, then had the pages copied by a photostat firm. He returned the book to the library and kept the stack of photostats beside his desk as a guide for his drawing. His employers were delighted with the improved realism of the drawn cartoons, and he and Ub began turning them out for Film Ad. Walt was dissatisfied with the material given to him by the Film Ad copywriters, and he began injecting gags of his own. I mean, of course he did. It's Walt Disney. In an ad for a bank, he depicted a man floating down a river on a raft with the catchline, "You can't drift through your life." For another bank, he drew a locomotive chasing a cow. "You'll never get anywhere until you get on the right savings track." For a maker of canvas car covers, he showed an automobile with a sparkling top. The dialogue between owner and friend. "Hi, old top, new car?" "No, old car, new top." That one actually still translates because there are still soft top cars out there, and I would assume you can change the tops out. The Film Ad Company made live-action movies as well as cartoons, and Walt portrayed paint salesmen or garage mechanics in the films. When an automobile careened down a nearby hill and crashed onto its side in front of the film office, a resourceful filmmaker grabbed a camera and shouted, "Come on, Diz, follow me!" Walt hurried outside and climbed into the overturned car. The cameraman spun the wheel and threw some dust in the air as the dazed young man emerged from the accident. The film became an ad for an insurance company. Great day in the morning. Different time. I think this is probably where I have to tell you, don't try that at home. Walt and Roy Disney were living with their brother Herbert and his wife in the house their parents still owned at 3028 Bellefontaine. Both young men often visited the home of Roy's sweetheart, Edna Francis, arriving conveniently at mealtime. During the meal, and often into the night, Walt talked about his work at Film Ad and his plans to advance beyond advertising films into something more rewarding. The young artist was developing a style. While his vocabulary was unpolished and he sometimes used barracks language, which, if I'm not mistaken, is a euphemism for simply swearing up and down, he could express himself surprisingly well, especially when he was relating a fable or gag sequence he planned to draw. Now that he was earning a steady salary, he could afford to dress with a flair. I love that song for Bedknobs and Broomsticks, by the way. David Tomlinson just cut such an inimitable character. Photographs show him as a young man in jaunty tweed cap, trim double-breasted dark suit with gray vest, four in hand neatly tied. I think that's a tie knot, but I could be mistaken. He is swinging a golf club in a city park and clowning in a statue pose atop a giant urn, a cigar clamped in the side of his mouth. Then he appears at the Kansas City Artists' Ball in full Western regalia, looking as handsome as a Hollywood cowboy. He was full-grown at almost 6 feet, and he had no trouble getting dates with the girls who worked for Film Ad. Walt's ingenuity distinguished his work at Film Ad, and sometimes covered up his lack of draftsmanship. Assigned to a theater commercial for a hat company, he realized that he couldn't draw the handsome faces ordinarily seen in hat ads. Instead, he drew comic faces under the hats, and they delighted codger and theater audiences as well. My, but that's graceful. Walt wanted to do his own experimenting, and he asked Codger for the Codger? I'm really not sure how you pronounce that, and if I'm going back and forth, I'm sorry. Codger for the loan of one of the company's stop-action cameras. Codger resisted at first, but Walt continued asking him, and he gave in. Walt enlisted Roy to help rig a makeshift studio in the family garage. Working past midnight every night, Walt experimented with incandescent lights, called inkies, until he achieved the best exposure for his drawings. He needed a subject that would capture local attention, and he decided to exploit the anger of Kansas City citizens over the poor repair of city streets. I would love to draw his attention to Bass Road in Macon, Georgia right about now. In the hyperbolic style that marked his early cartooning, he depicted drivers losing their teeth when striking ruts, and trucks disappearing into gaping holes. Get out of my book, Bug. He wanted to photograph his own hand making the drawings in the manner of the Out of the Inkwell cartoons, but he couldn't fit his hand under the camera. So he made a photograph of his hand and moved the photograph under the camera to create the illusion that he was drawing. Walt completed 300 feet of cartoon and took the film to the Newman Theater Company, which owned 3 movie houses in Kansas City. "I like it, kid," said the manager, Milton Feld. "I can use one every week." "How much do they cost?" Excuse me. Walt calculated his expenses and replied, 30 cents a foot. Feld agreed to pay that amount, and Walt left the office elated until he realized that the 30-cent figure did not provide any margin for profit. Walt worked all day at Film Ad, then spent hours each night in his garage studio. Feld gave him suggestions for new cartoons, a theater anniversary, a political campaign, a Christmas program. Feld asked Walt's help with a bothersome problem for theaters: patrons who bothered their neighbors by reading aloud the titles for the silent movies. Walt created a comical professor who slammed a mallet on the head of title readers or released a trapdoor that shooted them to the street. I understand most of us put subtitles on our Netflix these days. I'm hearing impaired myself. I need those subtitles. If you read the subtitles, I will smack you with a mallet. Got it? Good. Walt named the films Newman Laughograms. A few of them have survived, and they show surprising skill in an artist so new to animation. Where are they? I want to know where they are because I want to see these. The cartoonist's hand skims over the paper, seeming to make the droll drawings in lightning speed. As his knowledge of cartooning grew, Walt introduced real animation. You know, that kind of brings to mind I want to say it was Chuck Jones cartoon, Duck Amuck, wherein the hapless Daffy Duck is drawn and redrawn by the visible hand of Bugs Bunny. Ain't I a stinker? Everybody remember that one? If you don't, seriously, your life is missing something. Go watch it. Kansas City's spring cleanup, obviously based on one of the city's periodic police scandals, shows a parade of policemen marching into headquarters. Signs of a struggle come from within, then bodies fly out. I find shadow action to this day hilarious. A man exits from the building to hang a sign, "Cops Wanted." There can be no doubt that the scandal-weary Kansas City audience reacted with applause. The Newman Laughograms began making a minor celebrity of Walt Disney. Can you imagine a minor celebrity? When he met friends from Benton School, they remarked about seeing his films. His boss at Film Ad was proud of Walt's achievements and always introduced the young man to important visitors. Codger asked to borrow the Laughograms to show his company's offices in other cities what could be done with cartoons for theaters. Walt had been urging Codger to buy sheets of celluloid so the staff could copy the methods of the New York cartoon studios. Walt ordered 100 new celluloids. The purchasing agent changed the order to cheap discards, and they arrived scratched and ink-stained. But Walt and his fellow workers cleaned each one with solvent and soft cloths. For Walt, it was a thrill, finally, to make cartoons on celluloid, as all the important New York cartoonists did. His vision grew. "Why don't we make a series of cartoon shorts to sell to theaters?" he proposed to Codger. The company owner rejected the suggestion. Film Ad had a thriving business of selling advertising movies to theaters throughout the Midwest. He saw no reason to attempt something new and risky. Roy Disney had proved himself a steady, conscientious worker at the First National Bank, and his salary had increased enough to allow him and Edna Francis to talk seriously about getting married. During 1920, Roy suffered 2 serious attacks of influenza, and his doctor recommended removal of his tonsils. As an aside, you can actually still find tonsil guillotines at oddity and medical ephemera shops. I don't know if they were still in use as of 1920, but you can still find models in working order. If you locate one, let me know. For collection purposes, of course. His brother Herb suggested a surgeon who would perform the operation during Roy's lunch hour at the bank. Roy had the surgery done one noon and returned to his job. Unsurprisingly, his throat hemorrhaged and Mitchell Francis rushed him home. Afterward, X-rays detected a spot on Roy's lungs. It was tuberculosis. The Veterans Administration assigned him to a hospital in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was a tearful parting for Roy and Edna. 5 years would pass before they could marry. Again, Elias Disney failed. His investment in the jelly factory disappeared in bankruptcy, and the company president was imprisoned for fraud. Forgive me, it's awfully polleny out here. Again, Elias sought to improve his fortune by moving on. He and Flora returned to Kansas City, where he sought work as a carpenter. Elias found the garage of the Bellefontaine house taken over by Walt's contraptions. Elias didn't understand why his son wasted his time on such things, but he allowed Walt to continue using the garage for a rental of $5 a month. Elias found little work in a housing industry hit by the post-war slump. He helped one of Flora's relatives build a house in Glendale, California, but decided against moving house there because the country was too arid. The Postal Service had transferred Herb to Portland, Oregon, and he urged his parents to join him. Elias decided they would, and in November 1921, he and Flora and Ruth left Kansas City by train. Walt went to the station for their departure, and Ruth noticed tears forming in his eyes. He said his goodbyes and left abruptly. New owners moved into the Bellefontaine house, and Walt shifted his belongings to a rooming house. His enterprise had outgrown the garage, and he now rented a small shop. He could no longer do all the work himself, and he advertised for boys who wanted to learn the cartoon business. 3 applied, and Walt conducted night school in the tiny shop, teaching the elements of cartooning. He told the boys he couldn't afford to pay them, but promised they would share in the future profits of the enterprise, for which he confidently predicted success. To achieve that success, Laugh-O-Grams needed to progress beyond the 1-minute program filler. The next step would be cartoon shorts like those produced by the New York studios. He devised plans for a series of cartoons based on traditional fairy tales, modernized and sprinkled with gags. For 6 months, Walt and his youthful filmmakers worked at night on their first production, Little Red Riding Hood. Walt was so pleased with the cartoon that he quit his position at Film Ad, where he had been earning an impressive $60 a week. On May 23, 1922, he incorporated Laugh-O-Gram Films with $15,000 from local investors who contributed $250 to $500 apiece. The new firm's capital equipment included 3 inkers and tracers tables, 7 chairs, 3 animating booths, 1 cabinet, superintendent's desk, projector, winder, electric fan, 800 feet of positive film, 1 still camera, movie camera and stand, lighting equipment, and copying stand. Walt persuaded UB Iwerks to leave Film Ad, and Laugh-O-Gram Films took over the remaining assets of Iwerks Disney commercial artists. They were joined by 5 other young animators: Hugh Harmon, Rudolph Ising, Carmen Maxwell, Lori Tague, Otto Walliman, as well as a business manager, a girl who inked and painted the celluloids. I really want to know her name, by the way. A salesman, and a secretary. I would like to know her name too. All worked in a 5-room suite on the 2nd floor of the McConaughey Building at 31st Street and Forest. Laugh-O-Gram Studios started production of a series of fairy tale films following the pattern of Little Red Riding Hood. The salesman went to New York to hunt for buyers, and he made a releasing deal with a non-theatrical distribution company, Pictorial Clubs. The company sent a check for $100 and a note promising $11,000 for 6 cartoons. The workers at Laugh-O-Gram were jubilant, and Walt put 5 additional subjects into production: The 4 Musicians of Bremen, Jack and the Beanstalk, Goldilocks and the 3 Bears, Puss in Boots, and Cinderella. The Laughogram office was an exhilarating place to work. The president of the company was 20 years old, and he declined to act the role of executive. He did some of the animation, operated the camera, washed the celluloid sheets, or cells, for reuse. Many of his employees were still in their teens, and they shared his zest for the cartoon medium, often working past midnight. They were unconcerned when they received only half of their salaries on weeks when the company treasury was low. And I swear, if you knock over my ginger ale, cat. Luther. On Sundays, they joined Walt in Swope Park or on the roof of their office building and acted out the charade of filming a melodrama. Walt had bought a universal camera for $300, and it saw multiple duty. On weekends, Walt mounted it on the rear seat of a touring car and rode through the downtown Kansas City streets, cranking the camera, his cap turned backwards like a Hollywood cameraman. A sign on the car read, "These pictures will be shown at the Isis Theater tomorrow night." Walt contracted with the Jenkins Music Company to make a film illustrating the song Martha, which happens to be my middle name. And he took 3 girls from the office to a nearby woods to film a sequence. He delighted in playing the director, complete with megaphone. He used the camera as Kansas City correspondent for Selznick, Pathé, and Universal newsreels. When the New York offices telegraphed Disney with special assignments, cartoon filming ceased. Walt removed the camera from the cartoon stand, picked up a tripod, and hurried out to photograph a news event. He rode the streetcar to an automobile lot, rented a Ford motoring car, and placed a press sticker on the windshield. He received an important assignment to cover the American Legion Convention, which was being attended by Vice President Coolidge, Marshal Foch, and General Pershing. The father of a school friend owned the building across the street from the reviewing stand, and Walt carried his camera to the roof. It was a perfect vantage point to film the dignitaries and the parade. Payment for such assignments was $1 for a foot of film. Usually 100 feet was ordered. If the newsreel did not use the film, the equivalent amount in unexposed negative was returned to him. Well, now where do you think you're going? Walt was convinced he could sell newsreel footage of airplane acrobatics, and he persuaded a couple of barnstorming pilots to perform for him. Walt consulted a cameraman friend on how to photograph in the air. He was told to stop down all you can, limit the exposure to the barest minimum. That reminds me that, of course, one of my favorite rides at all of Walt Disney World remains. I know it's a kiddie ride, but there's something about Goofy's Barnstormer that never gets old. Walt took his camera up in one of the planes and photographed some daring stunts. When his film was developed, it was totally dark except for a white donut caused by the whirring propeller. He had stopped down too far. The camera was also used in taking baby pictures for proud Kansas City parents. That part of the enterprise resulted in publicity from the newspaper that Walt had once delivered, the Kansas City Star. Block quote, "The Laughogram Films Company Incorporated, 1127 East 31st Street, has added the feature of photographing youngsters to its regular business of making animated cartoons. An admiring parent wishing to preserve the native graces of his progeny's actions notifies Walt Disney, president of the corporation and head cartoonist for the animated cartoons. The company furnishes a projector service with its filming, which provides that a private showing be made in the home, 3 showings for each 100 feet of film." By the autumn of 1922, It was becoming more and more difficult for the youthful filmmakers to maintain their exuberance. The fairy tale cartoons were being shipped off to pictorial clubs, but no money returned. Under the contract, no payment was required until 6 months after signing, and by that time pictorial clubs had gone bankrupt. For producing the half-dozen 7-minute cartoons, Laugh-O-Grams had been paid only the deposit, $100. With salary checks growing thinner, Laugh-O-Gram employees began to drop out. Ub Iwerks left the company to return to film ad. In late November, Walt persuaded his principal backer, Dr. Cowles, to supply an additional $2,500 to satisfy the company's major creditors. Walt found himself unable to pay his rooming bill, and for a couple of weeks he roomed with Ub Iwerks. Then Walt took up lodging in the Laugh-O-Gram offices. The rent had been paid in advance. Like others in the office, he ate on credit at the Forest Inn Cafe downstairs, operated by a pair of Greeks, Jerry Ragos and Louis Katsis. Since the offices had no bath, Walt made a weekly journey to the railroad station, where he bought a warm tub, a towel, and a bar of soap for a dime. After the bath, he stood on the platform where he had seen his parents, his sister, and Roy depart for the West. He couldn't avoid tears as he watched the passengers leaving for other towns and cities. It was so lonesome, he recalled in later years. One day in December, a local dentist, Thomas B. McCrum, paid a call to the Laugh-O-Gram office to inquire about a film to promote dental health. He was surprised to find that young Disney was the only person in the office, but they discussed the film and agreed on a fee of $500. In later years, Walt liked to tell the story of how Dr. McCrum telephoned one evening and asked Walt to come to his house to complete the deal. Walt said that he couldn't. He confessed that his only pair of shoes was at the cobbler, and he didn't have the $1.50 to redeem them. The dentist came to the office and gave him money for the shoes and an agreement for the dental health film. Walt hired back some of his Laugh-O-Gram workers for Tommy Tucker's tooth, and the unexpected revenue recharged his ambition. He searched for another subject to put Laugh-O-Gram back in business. He had admired the Out of the Inkwell cartoons produced by Max Fleischer. I have my own opinions on him, but I'll keep those to myself, shall I? In which cartoon figures animated on the drawing board of artists. Why not reverse the technique and put a human figure in a cartoon world? He devised the idea of Alice's Wonderland, in which a real girl would act out adventures amid cartoon figures. He hired Virginia Davis, a winsome 6-year-old model with Mary Pickford curls, and photographed her against a plain backdrop, devising a storyline that would be drawn later. I don't know if this reveals you my age, but I remember a segment on Walt Disney that used to air in the very, very early morning on the Disney Channel, and Virginia Davis recalled being in these Alice shorts. I don't know if she's still alive, but she certainly was at that point in time. If she is now, she's very old. He sent off enthusiastic letters to distributors in New York. One letter, dated May 14, 1923, went to a woman named M.J. Winkler, who distributed Out of the Inkwell and other cartoons. Block quote. "We have just discovered something new and clever in animated cartoons. The first subject of this distinctly different series is now in production and will require a few weeks more for completion. It is a new idea that will appeal to all classes and is bound to be a winner, because it is a clever combination of live characters and cartoons, not like Out of the Inkwell or Earl Hurd's, but of an entirely different nature, using a cast of live child actors who carry on their action in cartoon scenes with cartoon characters. Pardon my itch. These new subjects will be a full reel in length and can be released at regular intervals of 2 weeks or a month. Disney suggested that Miss Winkler see Laugh-O-Gram's previous cartoons for pictorial clubs as an example of the company's work. She replied with an encouraging letter, and Walt began production. But his resources dwindled further. Dr. Cowles advanced him an occasional $10. Roy, who had moved from Santa Fe to another hospital in Tucson, sent Walt a blank check with instructions to fill it out with any amount up to $30. Walt wrote it for $30. The money soon disappeared, and Walt's bill at the Greek restaurant continued to mount. When it reached $60, Jerry said his partner wouldn't allow him to extend any more credit. 2 days later, Jerry went up to the Laugh-O-Gram office and found Walt sitting on a box and eating beans out of a can. "Oh, Walter," said the Greek, "I don't care what my partner says. You go downstairs and get something to eat." With Alice's Wonderland half finished, Walt found himself completely out of funds. Walt went to his early investors and asked them to help keep Laugh-O-Gram in business, but they had already resigned themselves to losing their money and saw no reason to throw away more. Excuse me. Oh. On June 18th, Walt dispatched a brave letter to Miss Winkler. Block quote, "Owing to numerous delays and backsets we have encountered in moving into our new office, we will not be able to complete the first picture of our new series by the time we expected. However, it will be finished very soon, and the writer expects to be in New York about the 1st of July with a print of same and an outline for our future program." Unable to pay the rent at the McConaughey building, Walt moved into smaller quarters, but there was no way to continue. He described his situation in a letter to Roy, who had moved to a veterans hospital in Sawtell, west of Los Angeles. Roy replied, "Kid, I think you should get out of there. I don't think you can do any more for it." Walt resigned himself to bankruptcy. When settlement was made years later, the creditors received 45% of their claims. A modest income had been received from the successors to the pictorial clubs. Another cartoon maker in Kansas City offered Walt a job, but he wanted to leave the scene of his failure and to leave the cartoon business as well. Instead of heading for New York, where the cartoon studios were centered, he was going to Hollywood, where he planned to become a director. His only problem was raising the railroad fare. He went door to door photographing babies, then sold his camera and bought a one-way ticket to California. He left Kansas City in July, wearing a checkered coat and unmatching pants. He had $40 in cash, and his imitation leather suitcase contained only a shirt, 2 undershorts, 2 pairs of socks, and some drawing materials. But when he paid his fare for the trip to California, he bought a first-class ticket. All right, that's the end of Chapter 5 and of Unit 1 for Walt Disney, an American Original by Bob Thomas. And this has once again been Anna Reed's. The shelter-in-place order for here in Georgia has been extended to the end of April. And, only God knows how long they're going to extend it more after that. So, in the interest of having just watched Saludos Amigos for the first time last night and taking to heart its message of expansionism over xenophobia and, where was I going with that? I think you know what I mean. Bring each other closer. Don't push each other apart. It really is a small world, cheesy as that sounds. We're here to take care of each other. I'm here trying to take care of you with the little bit I can do reading books on the internet, okay? Luther has picked up and gone that way somewhere. This here's Charlie the llama. And so I guess all there is to say is, now it's time to say goodbye to all our company. M-I-C, see you real soon. K-E-Y. Why? Because we like you. M-O-U-S-E. Oh, and you all know how to contact me by now, so see you soon.